Welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 21 February 2021. Flying cars, net neutrality, lots of supply chain stories, and all the show wrap-ups on the Security Weekly News wrap-up show.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the attackers that put our critical systems in jeopardy. Core Impact from Core Security is a penetration testing tool that safely finds vulnerabilities using the same techniques of adversaries, with certified exploits and wizards that guide you through critical pen tests while maximizing the time of advanced testers by automating their routines. With Core Security, you can safeguard your infrastructure by limiting access, detecting threats, testing for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitoring data. Visit securityweekly.com/core security.
All right, I'm Doug White from Roger Williams University. I'm your host, and welcome to Security Weekly News wrap-up show. All the show topics from the week on Application Security Weekly number 140. John and Mike had Brandon Edwards, the co-founder and chief scientist at Capsulate, or Capsulate, I think you're probably supposed to say that, Capsulate, on to talk about attacks targeting Linux. So recent attacks against sudo were an example. So that was a big deal about that sudo had vulnerabilities in it. And, you know, we were even talking about that on Security Weekly last night, and or maybe we were talking about that after the show. But there are a lot of different discussions now around Linux-based attacks and so forth. On Enterprise Security Weekly number 215, Adrian, Paul, and Tyler Shields covered the news in the first segment. In the second segment, Christopher Crowley, a consultant at Montants LLC, joined in to talk about the 2020 SOC survey results. So pretty interesting thing there. A lot of us are building or have built SOCs in the recent years, and it's quite interesting to see what's going on there. In the third segment of the show, Amit Malik and Ganesh Pai, the principal researcher and the founder CEO at Uptix, respectively, we're on to talk about MITRE attack vendor evaluations, and in particular focus on the threat groups Carbonac and Fin7. They also talk about the new MITRE attack cloud matrix, which is definitely worth checking out. I mean, I was very interested in this new MITRE cloud business. I think that's a very relevant and germane thing. On Business Security Weekly number 206, Paul, Jason, and Matt had Dutch Schwartz, a cloud security strategist at Amazon Web Services, and he was on to talk about the cloud and its influence on security culture. I really, there was a bunch of great segments this week that I really enjoyed, and I liked that one as well. I was very interested to hear from AWS people about that. In the second segment, are businesses underinvesting in cybersecurity? Of course they are. I want to raise 4 tips to help CISOs get more C-suite cybersecurity buy-in. Again, I think that's one of the most critical. I mean, research has shown you for years and years that that's a very critical thing. New CISO priorities of 2021 and many more news stories. I'm telling you, if the C-suite's not on board, when I was an auditor, if you didn't have the clout of the C-suite behind you, good luck. People will push back and you'll get nowhere. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 62, Flea, Jeff, and Scott were joined by John Threat. And again, this was just this like awesome show. John Threat, who a very interesting person, and John talked about how he became a hacker. Bashed on white hat hackers a bit, but this was really fun, and they did 2 whole segments with John. In the second segment, though, Chris Cochran, who's the founder and producer at Hacker Valley Media, and John Threat, and also Ronald Eddings, who's a security architect and podcast host at Hacker Valley Studios, joined in to talk about hackers and threat actors, 2021 implications. It was really good. I mean, that show is always quite interesting, but this was a particularly good one, and John Threat was just a lot of fun. On Security Weekly News number 101, my binary show, Jason Wood talked about the importance of creating a training exercise, and he described some tools that were, freely available that would allow you to kind of start doing some training for yourself. So a nice commentary from Jason there on my first show back after being gone for 2 weeks. On Paul's Security Weekly number 684 last night, finally, I got to return. It was the first time I'd been back on Security Weekly this year, if you can believe that. I had not been on, and I'd missed it so much because when I got home, I was telling my wife, it was like, being on Security Weekly is like being in a graduate seminar. And I was actually comparing it to a graduate seminar I took a long, long time ago. And I was literally saying, it's literally like you not only have to be, knowledgeable on a subject, but you also have to be ready for whatever comes up. And it's just, you should get college credit for Security Weekly. But in the first segment, Peter Warmka, who is a former CIA intelligence officer, he was talking about his new book, which is called Confessions of a CIA Spy, The Art of Human Hacking. And he is an expert on social engineering. And it was a really nice segment to talk with somebody who had been, Peter's not just like somebody who worked in an office somewhere. He was like actually in, other countries doing, like movie spy stuff. Very nice segment. And the second segment, and then he was like, how are we going to top this? In the second segment, Brian Seeley, who's a senior security architect and evangelist at Sciemptive Technology, was on, and he was talking about. Initially, he was talking about why he was famous, which was that he wiretapped the U.S. Secret Service and the FBI. He did a bunch of other stuff that he talked about on the show as well. But he also talked about his life, which was quite interesting and very inspirational because he has had a lot of ups and downs. And he was very willing to share this with us and with you. So definitely check that out. And, of course, we had a great news segment. My favorite thread of this week is just going to continue all week. It seems like I have been focused on this, and it started with President Biden putting out an executive order early in the week about supply chain threats. And everybody was talking about this, and we talked about it quite a bit on the news show last week. A lot of it was triggered, I think, by the SolarWinds attack, which is still just sort of having fallout. And President Biden did write that executive order then on the 24th. So basically, and I put the executive order on here again, and I have been talking about this. I had on the show last night. But he's basically directing all these federal agencies to start looking not just at the cyber aspects, but that was included, which was really, really good to see because there's not a specific cyber agency at a cabinet level. There probably should be, but there's not. But he was asking everybody across the board to start looking at supply chain threats. I was very happy because, the cyber side of supply chain is really kind of, I'm not sure everybody understands what people mean by this because it's really two different things. So there's this sort of supply chain component, which is about critical infrastructure. So how does, a loaf of bread get from a bakery to the grocery store and all these kind of things. But there's also, all those systems that are involved in getting that stuff done. But then there's also this this SolarWinds idea of embedded libraries and embedded threats that are now coming down the supply chain in code that ended up in SolarWinds, which then ended up in all these other government-based systems. So that's kind of a scary business for us. And like I say, we talked about it quite a bit last night. Former President Trump had created a start on this with an executive order way back early in his term that actually created this sort of CISA stuff that we're seeing today and then appointed Chris Krebs. But then, of course, toward the end of President Trump's term, he fired Chris Krebs because he wouldn't back some false information that they wanted put out there. But the establishment of CISA and all this has really been a move forward. But now I'm hoping that this new executive order starts to put a focus on critical infrastructure, which is, I've been yapping about that for a long time. If you know me, I remember talking to FEMA back in like 2005 about this and how important it was that we look at critical infrastructure and the potential for that to be attacked, not just directly, but to be attacked through things like these supply chain attacks. And, you don't have to get too carried away with disaster scenarios before cyber starts being impacted, and it starts impacting as well. So once you get inside the government and all these different entities and, all of a sudden everybody from the local dog catcher all the way up the ladder to, DHS, FBI, the executive branch and so forth, all of that can be impacted by these kind of supply chain threats because they're all using, if the White House is using Microsoft and Microsoft is impacted by some library that was embedded in the calculator 20 years ago that's still being used. All of a sudden, there's a supply chain threat, all over the place. If we see these failures in infrastructure from the pandemic, and we've seen that, just regular old failures of really old, poorly maintained systems, you have to start wondering what something like solar winds, might do to us in terms of bringing down all kinds of different systems. And I don't like to be that person that's like, being out there ridiculous, over the top, running around screaming and flapping our arms. But as those things start to happen, and the pandemic led to that, I don't think anyone really truly understands the deep impact of these kind of supply chain attacks, except maybe us. So we have to start doing that. I mean, remember when all those military records burned up in the Pentagon, if you ever heard about that? But they had a fire in the Pentagon, and all these politicians started claiming all sorts of heroics, even though they hadn't done that. I mean, that really happened, right? I mean, suddenly they didn't have records of who got medals and who did this. And so suddenly some guy who operated the base slushy machine in San Diego during the Vietnam War jumps in and says, oh, no, I was out in the jungle and I earned a Silver Star. And they go buy a medal online. And this is called stolen valor. And they actually have websites to report people. And there's been several prominent politicians got busted doing this kind of stuff. But I mean, think about that on a larger scale. I mean, everything's backed up, right? Yeah, right. And we can get it and we can recover, sure. But I mean, I guess the real issue to me from this executive order is to start delving into the issue, which is what I was pleased about. It was really, how do we start seriously thinking about these issues? And Tyler and I were talking about that, and Joff and I were talking about that last on the show. About how do we fix this? And my answer is I don't think we know right now. So seeing funding starting to come through in new and different ways by labs and DARPA. Those were the ways that in the past we've gotten new and innovative ways of dealing with various problems. Like that's where the internet came from, right? So that may be what we really need here, is to not just say, how do we authenticate code, but maybe there's a fix. Maybe somebody needs to design a new mousetrap. And the other piece of this, of course, is about dependence. And dependence on technology and supply chains. And you can start asking yourself, how dependent are you? I mean, I'm not one of those Ted Kaczynski Luddite people that think technology is going to ruin us all. And we no longer know how to fight a bear to get food and avoid freezing to death. So I live off the grid in a shack with no running water and typhus. But I am concerned about dependence. I mean, the early pandemic was really scary because you started seeing empty shelves and people talking about, well, what if this stops working and so forth. And, all of us were sort of sitting there going, wow, what if I couldn't order, toilet paper from Amazon? And how far away are we? And last night I said this, and Joff immediately said, aren't we already there? But how far away are we from our car refusing to start because it can't uplink to some central server to validate all the systems? And all the code that's managing your car is located in the cloud, or it's a Lambda or whatever. I mean, can you survive without an internet connection? Or are you like me and saying, hey, Majel, how do you fight a grizzly bear that's out on my front porch because I need food and warm clothes? And if you don't know, Majel Barrett was the voice of the enterprise computer, like all of them. And in fact, interesting point on that, Majel Barrett actually recorded herself so that they could continue to use her voice for all the future. Before she died, she recorded all these things. So anyway, I think the time is right. I think we need to start looking at this at all levels, not just government, but in private. And we need to start thinking about dependence and resilience if we want to continue playing this game and avoid all those Mad Max type outcomes where we're all just dressed in really wild, punk rock outfits driving semi-trucks through the desert. All right, enough. I could talk about that all day, really. So ANSI, the French Information Security Agency, published a warning that hackers with links to Sandworm had breached several organizations in France. And Sandworm is a group in the GRU, which we've heard about many times on this show and others. That's Russian military intelligence. The victims that they reported were mostly IT firms and web hosting companies, and the campaign has apparently been going on since 2017. They did not know how they were hacked, so again, it starts to sound like solar winds, but they did find in some systems a backdoor called PAS and another one called XRML, which had been previously associated with Sandworm in the past by ESET, which you've heard me talk about before, which is a Slovakian security firm. Domain Tools spokesperson Joe Slovic said that while the end game in these attacks was not obvious, that Sandworm typically has the objective to cause some sort of noticeable disruption. And again, last night, Tyler was talking about how, maybe the SolarWinds thing was found out too soon, that it might have been the case that this was a deeper approach and it was, was meant to be used in some future action, but it got found out. Microsoft announced that the SolarWinds attack, which was disclosed by FireEye and Microsoft back in December, and I know you've heard me mention it on the show already multiple times, they described the attack as probably the largest and most sophisticated attack the world has ever seen to date. This was based on an interview on 60 Minutes with Brad Smith, who's the current president of Microsoft. He went on to say that Microsoft had 500 engineers investigating the attack, and that the attackers probably had at least twice this number developing the attack. Now, I'm not sure I followed his math on this. I mean, it seemed kind of like, okay, I'm just going to arbitrarily say that there must have been 2 times the number of engineers. It's like some kind of weird, if Microsoft, it's a weird story problem. Microsoft has 500 engineers. If Russia has twice as many engineers as Microsoft, how many engineers does Russia have now? Not sure how he got there exactly, but it is a great point that someone really put some serious effort in on this SolarWinds attack. So worth a read there. And okay, last one. So a new type of supply chain attack was described by Alex Burson. Basically, if you push a public repository with some new package that is the same name as another dependency, well, the dependencies were downloaded and installed despite the contents not being legit, because there's not really a way to validate that. It was just like, it has the right name, it's in the right place, boom, to download it. And he did this. He did a proof of concept, and he actually did it. And it's kind of like typo squatting, which and we've heard me say that term a lot, which has similar names, and Puni code attacks and all that stuff. But basically, this was actually, he just put the same name up. And so these pieces of software that had dependencies went out and downloaded, the fake code. So the automatic updaters didn't check the code, and I don't know how they would check it anyway. They just look for the name. So it says this is called the right thing. Download it, install it. Oops. The article does have a list of steps that you can take to try and prevent these types of attacks, which they are calling dependency confusion attacks, which is a pretty good name. And I do think this is going to get worse, because every day we rely more and more on outside code to solve problems. And again, we talked about this last night some about solving difficult problems and what I call the long dark night of programming, which is where you're just up against a wall, you can't get it to work, you're going crazy, and you say, oh my God, there's a solution right here on GitHub. All I got to do is download it and embed this. And you've got a time constraint. They're saying the marketing promised this product would be in the box and out for distribution on Friday. It's Thursday night and it still doesn't work. And you go, but here's something that fixes it. And voila, there's the answer. And the next thing you know, you've got some repository that you never even looked at, but it made it work and it's in place. And that's the coming storm of our lives as developers. Okay, I lied. One more. Ukraine accused the Russian government of hacking one of the Ukrainian government's web portals and dropping malware in the form of documents there. Now, this is a pretty standard kind of attack, but according to the Ukrainian officials, the attack was to contaminate public information resources, and the document contained a macro. They also had one that had a PowerShell script, apparently, that dumps a remote access Trojan onto the victim's computer. Now, Russia has often been linked to the former Soviet state of Ukraine in attacks on them, and there's certainly no love lost between these two. The most famous, of course, the 2015 attack on the Ukrainian power grid that they did in midwinter, that Ukraine associated with Russia. And this seems to be yet another form of supply chain attack, which I was, again, thinking about when I read that executive order, talking about what if you could just create distrust of the government? So the data that the government provides, because one of the long-standing things, at least in the United States, has been that we typically, the courts, corporations trust data that's being disseminated by the U.S. government. But if they could start making us distrust those sources, that creates a lot of unrest. And if you listen to Peter Warmka last night talking about espionage techniques, well, you kind of get how these supply chain things get started out of traditional espionage techniques, which is to create distrust and unease and so forth. So there's a lot of history behind CIA, KGB, GRU, and all these kind of things and how that got put together. If you haven't already, warn your people about tax fraud season and malware that is coming up. It is tax season in the United States with federal income taxes and state income taxes due on April 15th. Of course, it has become an annual event with cyber to see people being targeted with everything from fake filings to phishing attacks, all the usual suspects. But everybody's apprehensive about taxes. This year, there's a new malware that was targeting a popular financial tool called QuickBooks. So QuickBooks is an accounting system. A lot of people use it. A lot of small and medium-sized companies use it. And basically, this attack is delivered via email, of course. And this report came from ThreatLocker. The tool basically exfiltrates your most recently saved QuickBooks files up to the internet where they can be cracked. ThreatLocker recommends that you evaluate the permissions of QuickBooks and ensure that the Everyone group is not selected for systems. ThreatLocker said that there had been a huge jump in this attack vector and that data recovered is being actively sold on the dark web. So you may want to, do your annual, be advised. Don't forget it's tax season and all those calls you're getting from the IRS telling you need to give them a credit card number in your bank account. Probably not real because the IRS only communicates by snail mail. Former President Trump eliminated national net neutrality protections early in his term of office. It was one of his big agenda items. And California immediately passed an open internet law in 2018, shortly after that happened. The law has been tied up in court by the Trump administration ever since, but since the Trump administration is now no longer with us and a lot of their people at the Justice Department are no longer with us, on Tuesday, a federal judge ruled against broadband providers who oppose this the net neutrality laws, which means that at least in California, the law may very soon be in effect. Now, if you don't recall, net neutrality was a controversy about the FCC saying that providers, the original net neutrality said providers couldn't block or slow down web traffic and sell fast lanes and all this kind of stuff. And the Trump administration got rid of that because they wanted providers, and broadband providers were actively campaigning for this, the ability to sell, that platinum lane, or they could slow down websites they didn't like and so forth. And there's a lot of ideology on both sides of this, so we won't get into the politics. And they wanted to be able to charge for this, of course. So if you want to pay more, you can have your website be faster. So somebody like Netflix may want to say, well, we're going to pay for the fast lane, and other companies may not do this. And of course, there's a lot of stuff. The California law put those protections back and said that it had to be an even playing field. But this was tied up in fighting with the government and the Justice Department ever since. But after the election of President Biden, he took office, and the subsequent, change of command in a lot of these departments, the Justice Department dropped their opposition to the California law. So there's at least a starting point for getting back to net neutrality. And again, we won't get into the politics of that. Finally, all my life, I've been promised a future with flying cars. I have. The Jetsons. So one of the earliest memories I have is watching the Jetsons cartoon. And, his boy Elroy, and they had these flying cars. And Deckard had one, right? I mean, so that was the first really high-profile kind of flying car thing. Star Wars had them. Even Bruce Willis had one in The Fifth Element. He had this, cool flying taxi. So where's mine? Well, despite the sheer terror of me thinking about Rhode Island drivers now adding a third dimension to their, driving, Uber and others have certainly been exploring the concept of what is basically a giant drone. There are many problems with this, not to mention bad drivers, the noise that drones make, and so forth. But now LinkedIn co-founder Reid Hoffman is moving into the space looking at flying taxis, so a la The Fifth Element. Hoffman and Mark Pincus are buying Joby Aviation, which had already bought Uber Elevate, which was Uber's venture into this in the realm, and they're buying it now for $6.6 billion. Uber is still an investor in this project. So reputedly, Joby has, according to them, has solved most of the flying car problems and claims they can make a quiet, drone-like taxi that can carry a pilot and 4 passengers at 220 miles per hour for 150 miles. They claim that the pricing of this service would be similar to Uber Black. So who knows? Maybe at long last you're going to be able to step out in your driveway, call for an Uber, and get one that flies you to the airport. Because like from my house to the airport in Rhode Island, like if in the air, that would be like, I think it's like 12 miles or something. It's really close, but driving is not. So I would love to have an Uber drone that costs the price of an Uber Black drop in my driveway and let me get it and they fly me over the airport. That would be, assuming we ever get back to actually flying anywhere. But anyway, that's the news wrap up for the week of 21 February in the time of plague. Get your shots. Come on. Well, if you can. I want one, but I can't get one.